We're going to start with a basic idea, make things a bit more complicated, and end up with a diorama I know you're going to lava. Let's go! I started with a little wooden box from the dollar store and some XPS foam. I cut it down to fit inside, but it was too deep, so I added a scrap piece of plywood to raise it up a bit. I marked the underside to keep things straight until the directions are a bit more identifiable. And then I glued the plywood to the bottom of the box. To fill the diorama scene, I printed some lazy forger models from the Enlisted Army set. It's going to be a convoy escorted by this mech walker. And I thought it would be cool to have a lava monster bursting through the ground to attack them. This huge boule from Yasashi Kyojin was the perfect thing for what I had in mind, and it's already breaking through some rocks. As always, I bought these things with my own money, and the links will be down in the description if you'd like to support these artists too. I laid out a scene and started to define two pools of lava with a sharp pencil. I traced around the monster too. This allowed me to know where I needed to remove foam to be able to set the model into the ground. With that hole dug, I started to carve some cracked earth patterns into the base with tighter breaks near the lava pools and larger sections toward the middle. After that, it was on to cutting out the depth of the pools themselves. And a quick blast with the heat gun hardened up the surface and opened up the cuts. I added a little texture with the foil ball as well. For the bubbling lava, I'm going to use some beads. But first, a coat of black Mod Podge. As you can see, there's an assortment of sizes here. I also got some that had no holes, so I wouldn't need to fill or hide them. Using some PVA glue, I started to add the bubbles to the pools. Don't let them escape. I wanted some higher bubbles too, so I carefully drilled into a few beads and set them on piano wire. This lava method is actually inspired by a guy called Orkbutt on Instagram, though the effect he gets is much more impressive. He said he uses fluoro paints, but I don't have anything like that at the moment. Looking at these rocks on the boule, they don't exactly match the feeling of the terrain. I chipped a few of them to make them jagged and dug out some more areas to be covered in breaking rocks. For the rocks, I was going to use XPS foam, but the pieces would be really hard to make so small and keep it convincing, so I instead opted to use cork. Breaking it rather than cutting it means you can get a nice uneven edge. I embedded some pieces into the foam and others I just glued on top or pinned in place with toothpicks. Next, it was onto the lava. I applied UV resin and spread it around the bubbles with a toothpick. I have a nice size UV light that I use for post-curing my resin prints, and that worked well, but I can never seem to get this kind of resin to cure without a slightly sticky surface, even after leaving it for over an hour in the sun. Is it me? Is it the brand? Or is it just the material? Let me know if you know. After curing the resin as best as I could, I mixed up some PVA with a little water, and then applied that to the broken earth. Starting with pebbles and working down to finer sand, I added some texture to even out the transition from the plain ground to the eruption. I also flicked on some glue to add random sand patches here and there for more interest on the wide open spaces, and help the glue flow with a spritz of isopropyl alcohol. Order of operations is really important, and now I have to clean off the resin and cracks from the sand that found its way there. Which it always does. It gets everywhere. I added some resin to the flat surfaces of the cork and the boule's rocks to change the texture. I even went back and added some more sand to tie the monster into the base once it was glued in place. And then came the contrast underlayer. I thinned down a very opaque white paint to flow into all the cracks, almost like a wash, and I put some through the airbrush as well. You may think this is looking kind of ruined, but just wait. I bought a makeup sponge and I used it to dab on the black paint over the flat surfaces of the rock. This was a new technique for me, and I found that you can't push too hard, but the sponge needs to have more paint on it than you would expect. In the end, I figured out a good method to be able to leave the lightness around the edges while keeping the bright white in the recesses, which meant it was onto the painting. I started with the lightest yellow I planned to use, and I painted the pools. Then I added some orange and red, as well as more water, and mixed it together to get a darker lava wash to contrast with the yellow. And then after going back and forth with oranges, yellows, and reds too many times, I finished painting the base of the diorama. Oh, except for the bubbles. I went back and hit the tops with some white to lighten them up to the highest brightness of the lava colors. I liked the burning effect that I got on the monster, but I think it looked a little bit flat, so I added some white highlights to the teeth and claws, and also dry brushed over the top with a metallic silver. On to the convoy. These little vehicles have convenient axles on the bottom, but I had to use some poster tack to hold the walker in place. Look at the details the primer brings out. To highlight those details, I overbrushed with the silver before laying on some base coats over top. I started making this awful yellow and blue color scheme before switching to a more basic olive green. I used my makeup sponge technique again and got some very satisfying results in a very short amount of time. The only other thing I did to the green was give it a pale greenish blue dry brush on the highlights. While I did like the green, these guys needed something more, so I grabbed a scarlet red and picked out a few panels and details here and there for accents. The detail on these prints is so good, I can't even paint every little thing, it's so small. I added some more details as best as I could, and I did a little edge highlighting. After that, I grabbed my Tamiya black panel liner and did a pin wash on all the recessed detail. The very last step was to use a toothpick and carefully add a speck of a highlight to each tiny spot. I find it can be easier than a brush sometimes, and this is tiny. If you've seen my other builds where I've used wood, then you'll know I like to use this cheap calligraphy ink to black it out while still preserving the grain pattern. I thought about burning the wood in the lava areas, but I decided not to this time. Once it was all inked up, I placed the diorama in its box, and that was that. I really need to improve my finished photography, but this thing looks great in person. I'd like to thank my direct supporters over on Patreon for keeping me creating. You guys rock. Let me know what you think in the comments. Go make something, and I'll see you on the next build.